How did life change when your father decided to run for president?
Wow, everything changed.
The greatest threat to national security, the greatest threat to the undermining of the rule of law,
was the stunning reaction from the mainstream media, both CNN and MSNBC, having a complete meltdown.
But may not be prosecuting for exercising core constitutional powers.
The thing that I really want people to pay attention to is when the government prints money, they get to take your money without asking Congress for permission.
On the Shawn Ryan Show, they got Mark Lamb, the sheriff of Pano County, Arizona, breaking down his wild journey. This dude went from being a missionary in South America to a top cop, promoting community policing and transparency through live PD. Known as the American Sheriff, Lamb is now gunning for a U.S. Senate seat. They talk about the biggest issues in law enforcement: dodging bullets, Lamb's teenage security detail, his bankruptcy, and his rise through the ranks. They also dive into the cartel wars, human trafficking, the FBI, and the ins and outs of running for Senate. Plus, Lamb drops advice for other community sheriffs out there. For the full context of this episode, click the link in the description below.
So when we talk national security, the greatest threat to national security, the greatest threat to the undermining of the rule of law is beginning right at the open border situation, not holding people accountable, letting them come in here and break the law, then flooding our communities with unknown people. You know, the Border Patrol is vetting like 5% of those people. And so now these people, once they come across the border, they don't just stay on the border. They filter into communities like mine or in Arizona or across the country. And it creates a real challenge for us as law enforcement because the federal government allowed unvetted people to come into my community. And not only that, we're taking people from third worlds and expecting that we're not going to turn into a third world when we bring them into our communities. It's not just a single tunnel. It's many tunnels. The cartels are flush with cash. They have the ability to build all sorts of stuff. You see a lot of tunnels down in places like Nogales, Arizona. On one side of Nogales is 50,000 residents or 30 to 50,000 residents. And on this other side is 500,000 residents in Mexico. You can have a house here or a business here, a road of 15 feet, the wall, a 15-foot road, and businesses right there again. So within 30, 40 feet, you have businesses or houses in Mexico and businesses and houses in Arizona. And so a lot of times those tunnels will go from one factory in Mexico and then pop up in somebody's business or somebody's home on the U.S. side. There's also, there's tunnels out in the middle of nowhere too, in the deserts.
Do you have an estimation of how many tunnels there are, maybe just in Arizona?
I mean, it's always changing. I mean, I think that you probably got hundreds. I don't know.
Hundreds of tunnels?
I mean, you're at least got, every cartel's going to have their own pieces of tunnels. Every smuggler within those cartels has their way of being able to smuggle the product. You remember, it's not like the cartel ushers these people down themselves. They have different smuggling units that work for the cartels. And those guys, well, the money they make is based on their ability to successfully smuggle.
How are they digging these tunnels?
By hand.
How big are they? Can they walk
some
through
are
them?
very like some of you could take a railroad little box through, which
They're
they
that
do.
big.
Most of them are built at least to where a grown man could walk in it. Many of them are built, they're fortified, just like you go into a mine and you would see these tunnels. And some of them are more rudimental. Some would be just, like you could crawl through it and get to the other side. It used to be under the last administration, it was a lot easier because the cartels weren't making as much money. They've gone from making $500 million to $13 billion a year.
In
and a
what
larger
time frame?
part, pretty much 2021. I mean, that changed right then.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Can you
It
say
changed
that again?
overnight.
So from 2021, they went from
They were
500
in 2020,
million?
they were making $500 million a year to 2021, now making $13 billion a year.
Wait, we're talking 1 year?
That's how quickly it changed. And they're consistently making that kind of money now because of the human trafficking and the drug trafficking. But the other part is they've become global. What we did with the open border policies, what happened is that you gave them the ability to grow their businesses. Why? Because you gave them cash on hand. Where does the cash on hand come from? It comes from the people who come from all over the world who now are going to give the cartel $5,000, $6,000, up to $50,000, depending on what country you come from. The cartel now has an influx of business coming in, and people are paying cash on hand. Their business model was different before. Their business model was a based on people coming and paying to come into the country. That was a part of it. But their business model was on selling drugs within the country. So what did they have to do? They had to pay out money to get the drugs into America. Then you got to pay to get the drugs to Omaha, Nebraska. Then you got to pay somebody to sell it. They take a cut of it. Now you have to pay somebody that's going to stay out there and recover the money, because they don't just work on good faith. You know, the cartel doesn't say, hey, Shawn, sell the drugs. Whenever you finish selling them, send them back. Send me the money. It's not how it works. So now you have somebody that they get paid to recover the money, and now they got to ship the money back down to Mexico and run the risk of getting caught. Business model of how they made money was a lot different. Now they have so much cash, you don't know what to do with it. So what are they doing now? They're expanding their operations globally. Now they're becoming the people that are providing the drugs and the fentanyl to places, not just in America, they're South America, Africa, Europe. They have become armies. They have enough funding now, billions of dollars, to buy the best guns, the weapons, the weaponry, the personnel carriers. I mean, these guys have miniature armies down there. So they're charging you to come across, and if you can't pay, they'll do it on credit, and then you have to work it off. So now you're seeing a lot of breaking and enterings and stuff because people owe the cartels. They don't want to, so I got to go steal something. If I can't find a job to pay for what I owe the cartel, then I'm going to steal it. The women end up working it off in the sex trade. The children, which, by the way, are about 150,000 unaccompanied minors a year right now. 150,000. Our government has admitted they don't know where about 100,000 of those children are. How are Americans not outraged to know that 100,000 children who came here alone without parents, we don't know where they're at? I'll tell you where they're at. They're in the cartels. The cartels are using them for hard labor and sex trade. And if you don't think so, let me just give you some statistics on child sexual abuse material, CSAM. CSAM is any photo or video depicting a child being raped or naked. 2014, we had 4 million reports of CSAM, 4 million, to the NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. 4 million reports of that. So that means people called and said, hey, this image, this, whatever, 4 million times. That's a lot. Last year was 32 million CSAM reports. 32 million. So don't tell me that these children are not being trafficked in this country. And we have become the biggest place for slavery, and we have been the biggest place for perverse things like child sexual abuse material.
The United States of America is the #1 consumer of child pornography in the world.
Yes. And the cartels are willing to meet that, and they make a lot of money off of it. And it's continual money.
What exactly is the cartel facilitating, and how are they able to control our border and who's coming across and who's paying and we're not?
So this is somewhat of an intricate thing, part of it, because there's the other part of it's the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations. The non-governmental organizations are charities that are being funded by taxpayer dollars. And so those charities have an incentive to continue to have a problem because they will continue to get money for their charities. Some of them well-intentioned, many of them are aiding and abetting in human trafficking. So the cartels know that these NGOs are willing to bring people to the border to bring them into this country. I think the flow of people would be greater into America if the cartel had the ability to handle more people coming into the country. You must pay the cartels. If they find out you don't pay them, you could end up dead in the desert. And so most people will not take the risk. Every now and then you might find somebody, which are very, very few and far between, who did not pay the cartels some money to come across.
Director of the FBI talk about how our power grid, water treatment plants, all of these are compromised by Chinese hackers. I've been talking about this for years, and this asshole shows up in front of Congress. Good fucking job, buddy.
Yes.
Federal Bureau of Investigation. Great work. Fucking asshole.
2 months ago, I was in DC, and he and Mayorkas both show up, and he starts talking about the same thing, the threats to our elections, the cybersecurity threats. And one of the sheriffs, he puts them on blast. He says, hey, the FBI is saying, get ready. We're going to have all these things. So the media calls me and they go, Sheriff, what do you think about this? You know, about the about the sheriff saying that the FBI is saying there's major threats. I go, first of all, I don't need the FBI to tell me that we've got threats going on in this country. I've been telling them for 2 to 3 years that what we're facing. And now they're finally admitting it. Like, this is where were you?
What does the FBI even do? I don't know. I don't even know what
at this point
fuck
go
they
after
do
Americans. Anymore. You know, there are good FBI agents. Unfortunately, those guys are timing out. A lot of these good FBI agents. We're not going to, we put a bureaucrat, a technocrat, a lawyer in charge of the FBI, not a line level guy who understands what it is to do the work and do investigations. They put a lawyer, Chris Wray, in charge of the FBI. They have a political agenda. And, you know, these good FBI agents on the ground, they're being told which direction to go in. And frankly, I see more effort on the FBI going after American citizens. We see them going after the parents at school boards. If you're listening to me and you're thinking, oh, he's just saying that, you know, political bullcrap. No. 2 years ago, I was in a meeting at the Greenbrier in West Virginia for a sheriff's conference, and we did an intel meeting, and the DHS chief comes on, not Mayorkas, but one of his guys, comes on over this Zoom, and he starts to say, hey, our primary concern are domestic violence terrorists. And I'm thinking, whoa, what is he about ready to say? And he goes, now these are going to be the parents at school boards, people who don't believe that the election was, you know, legit. And he starts going down veterans. He starts going down this list of people. My blood is boiling. He finishes, and the second he finished, I hit that thing and I said, how dare you say that the American person is your greatest threat? I said, not only did you describe me, you described many of the people that believe contrary to what this administration thinks. I said, then you felt that that's your greatest threat. Not once did you mention Antifa or BLM, and they literally wreaked havoc on this country over the last few years. You didn't mention them. You didn't mention the cartels that are trafficking tens of thousands of people into this country every month. You didn't mention the fentanyl poisonings, which has become the leading cause of death in America. You didn't mention any of that. You think that the primary threat to America is Americans. I said, I don't have any cases with Americans of what you're telling me, and I'm on the ground, boots on the ground. And he says, well, you know, Sheriff, we try to apply the law equally. And I said, well, your actions say otherwise. And I knew at that moment, many of us are the enemy to them.
Yeah.
And it's sad. It's sad because we're just patriots. We just love this country. We love God, family, freedom, and the Constitution, and that's what we're trying to protect.
On Breaking Point, Sagar and Jetty breaks down how the media's got Biden's back after his debate performance. He's showing how the press is spinning the story, trying to make Biden look good despite any slip-ups. Also joined by Glenn Greenwald, they discuss Biden's debate performance and where the Democrats will go from here. For the full context of this episode, click the link in the description below.
Just how bad Biden performed in the opening minutes of the debate. Stunning reaction from the mainstream media, both CNN and MSNBC having a complete meltdown. But what has happened since then has been now a stunning media correction to their previous cover-up, where many of the same voices who were insisting now for years that Biden was totally cogent, that he was up to the job, that he was actually stronger than everybody else, are now flipping on a dime and saying that he should drop out. First among them, Morning Joe Scarborough, with the greatest correction of all time.
However, you believe, and as do so many people who watch this program and who fear just how dark of a place a second Donald Trump term will take America, then I think it's critical that we ask the same questions about this man I love, respect, and whose public service in saving this country from Donald Trump over the last 3.5 years I honor and always will. I think we have to ask the same questions of him that we have asked of Donald Trump since 2016, and that is, if he were CEO and he turned in a performance like that, would any corporation in America, any Fortune 500 corporation in America, keep him on as CEO? Donald Trump lied over and over and over and over again. And Joe Biden couldn't respond to any of those lies. In fact, as the New York Times said, he spent much of the night with his mouth agape and his eyes darting back and forth. He couldn't fact check anything Donald Trump said. And not only that, he missed one layup after another. Why is this race close? We have no idea why this race is close. We saw last night tonight why this race has been close. And I fear Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States.
3 weeks before this debate performance, Joe Scarborough and his co-host Mika Brzezinski hacked anybody who distributed the so-called cheap fake showing Biden old, confused at the G7 summit. And yet, on a dime now, after the entire world can no longer deny his performance at the debate, now all of a sudden we have to ask these tough questions and why the race, which has been going on now for near 2 years, vast majority of polling showing that Biden is too old and voters don't trust him. Now we can openly say, yeah, maybe it is time to go, because at this point, it is no longer deniable. At the very same time, the elite media turn has been absolutely shocking to behold. Friday, we woke up to dozens of op-eds from the biggest media organizations across the center left. The New York Times editorial board speaking as a voice and also for the Sulzberger family. Quote, to serve his country, President Biden should leave the race. President Biden has repeatedly and rightfully described the stakes in this November's presidential election as nothing less than the future of American democracy. Donald Trump has proved himself to be a significant jeopardy to that democracy, an erratic and self-interested figure unworthy of the public trust. He is the candidate with the best choice of taking on this threat of tyranny and defeating it. His argument rests largely on the fact that he beat Trump in 2020. That is no longer a sufficient rationale from which Mr. Biden should be the Democratic nominee. At Thursday's debate, the president needed to convince the American public he was equal to the formidable demands of the office he is seeking to hold for another term. Voters, however, cannot be expected to ignore what was instead plain to see. Mr. Biden is not the man he was 4 years ago. Well, I would say he's not the man he was 10 years ago. There are now 4 separate editorials that have all called for Joe Biden to drop out of the race. Major papers, including New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Chicago Tribune, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. All polls that we have right now show Biden getting decimated. Both of us constantly just looking at the way that the media has been covering up for Joe Biden now, and for it to just come crashing down in front of their faces to expose them, honestly, as even bigger liars than we had seen before, has just been an amazing moment.
I think it's really important to remember that the people who first raised concerns about Joe Biden's cognitive decline and cognitive inabilities were people speaking in 2018 and 2019. And these were Democratic Party operatives, insiders, very worried that Biden was going to get the nomination kind of by default because he was by Obama's side, and thought they had this whole team of glittery new candidates who would do much better. And they were trying to warn people, including in public, this is not the same Biden. He's lost his fastball, using all these words. And it was a main theme of attack by people like Cory Booker and Julian Castro, who are running against him, when they would say things to him all the time like, hey, Joe, did you just forget what you said 2 minutes ago? It seems like you forgot what you just said. And this has been in the air for 5 years. And then once Biden got the nomination, it then became prohibited to raise it. The minute you raise it, they said, oh, that's a Sanders supporter or a MAGA fanatic attacking the character of this good man. But also there's been reporting, over the last year, including in the Wall Street Journal just a month ago, was very deeply reported about how oftentimes in meetings, Joe Biden just kind of zonks out. He kind of disappears. He disorients. You can't hear what he's saying. What he is saying is nonsensical. And the idea that anybody in media was shocked to see this version of Joe Biden on the debate stage is such an insult to our intelligence. And that's especially true given that Americans, ordinary Americans plugged into nothing and nobody, have been saying this for years, that they could see this with Joe Biden. So the media kind of wants you to believe that they were the last people to see it. Of course, what happened is they got caught lying and hiding for him, attacking anybody who raised this over the last year as some sort of, peddler of disinformation. And they were forced to admit what everybody saw, because even they, with their tiny credibility, couldn't deny it any longer. And now you have all these fraudulent narratives circulating about, oh my God, how this happened and who is to blame. They're all to blame. The Democratic Party, the Biden White House, his closest aides, and especially the corporate media who is aligned with it.
On the PBD podcast, they dive into some heavy-hitting topics. The Supreme Court just ruled that Trump has major immunity from prosecution, sparking all kinds of reactions. They also break down who might step up for the Dems if Biden decides to step down after his rough debate performance. CNN's Jake Tapper grills Biden's campaign co-chair, and Jamie Foxx opens up about a mysterious medical emergency that had him out for 20 days. San Francisco PD confirms full nudity is allowed in front of kids at pride parades, and a woman claims United Airlines booted her for misgendering an attendant. Plus, John Deere is planning big layoffs in 2 states, shifting jobs to Mexico. For the full context of this episode, click the link in the description below.
This is a Wall Street Journal story The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that former president enjoys sweeping immunity for their acts while in office, significantly impacting Donald Trump prosecution for allegedly attempting to subvert the 2020 election. Chief Justice John Roberts stated that the president may not be prosecuted for exercising his core constitutional powers and is entitled at a minimum to presumptive immunity from prosecution for all his official acts. The ruling dismissed parts of the prosecution's case against Trump, including his alleged efforts to use the Justice Department to support unsubstantiated election fraud claims, and unusual because it just imposes limited fines for or prison time and is in line with other punishment for criminal offenses. Prosecutors cannot inquire into Trump's motives and cannot use his official acts as evidence for unofficial ones, making it challenging to hold a trial before election.
Well, I think John Roberts got it right. And his quote, may not be prosecuting for exercising core constitutional powers. The left is freaking out this morning because they are missing that phrase because they're in denial. They don't want to hear it. Core constitutional powers. In other words, if the president is acting as a president, you can't turn around and use a law later to say, hey, I'm going to get back at you. And by the way, over the course of the springtime, reference this lightly in the ruling for Colorado because they says they can't create, that the states and the Congress can't be allowed to create what was called electoral mayhem. What do they mean by that? That means if I don't like your guy, I'm just going to start prosecuting him. I really don't care. I don't like what I don't like that executive order on this. I don't like that. So I'm going to come after you. And so the dissent by Sotomayor was disingenuous at best. She said, oh, we have kings now. So you're a king. You can do whatever you want. You could have SEAL Team 6 take out an opponent. That was ridiculous hyperbole from Sotomayor because of course that wouldn't happen. If the president used an assassin squad to assassinate a world leader, which is a technique that happens around the world in elections in different countries not named the United States, that's it. So I thought Sotomayor's response was bad, but this is the Supreme Court getting it right.
These are the likely Democratic presidential candidates if Biden drops out, as rough debate prompts calls to stand down. And by the way, this is a lot of different people. Van Jones, billionaire donors, the list goes on. Following President Joe Biden's rocky debate performance, there's growing concern within his party that he should step aside to avoid a Trump victory. Potential replacements include Vice President Kamala Harris, whose approval rating is below 40, raising concerns about her electability despite being the most obvious de facto choice. California Governor Gavin Newsom, rumored to have run a shadow campaign, has dismissed the possibility of running and pledged allegiance to Biden. Other governors like J.B. Pritzker from Illinois, Michigan's Gretchen Whitmer, Colorado's Jared Polis, and Pennsylvania's Josh Shapiro, who all won their races by double digits in 2022, are also stomping for Biden and have ruled out against him. Senator Bernie Sanders, who considered running if there was an open primary, has since endorsed Biden.
The undecided stays between 9 and 11. Now, that undecided in this poll was Green, Lib, Kennedy, and undecided. So there's a bucket in there. Does that make sense? All of those. And you look at it, Trump versus Biden. This is national. When you get into electoral and state by state, that's a different story. But on the national level, it doesn't matter. Biden versus Harris, it's the same thing. 48-45 Trump. And then Mayor Pete gets only 44, Booker 44, Newsom 44, Whitmer 44, Klobuchar, Minnesota 43, then Shapiro and Pritzker you just brought up 43. So basically you can see there's an entrenchment. It doesn't matter who's there.
Yeah.
There's just a little bit more undecided when you get to the candidates that are a little bit more unknown.
On this episode of Impact Theory, Tom Billy U chops it up with David Friedberg, an extreme optimist who believes entrepreneurship is the key to unlocking a better, more sustainable future. They break down the U.S. economic struggles, especially the risks of high debt and how heavy taxes can choke investment and stunt growth. They get into the game-changing potential of gene editing for agriculture and sustainable nutrition, balancing tech progress with regulations and the societal split over new innovations. Plus, they talk about how AI might reshape creativity and productivity. If you're all about innovation and the future of our economy, don't miss this episode. For the full context, click the link in the description below.
This feels very much like Ray Dalio's thesis that every time that you have a new world power rising and you have an economic superpower that's declining, you're going to end up in conflict. And I think that, and it's not 100% of the time, but it's something like 85% of the time historically. And Ray, I've talked about this on the show many times, but Ray did a survey, looked at the last 2,000 years, but really focused on the last 500 and the rise and fall of all these nations. He said it's always tied to the debt cycle. And what ends up happening is exactly what you've been describing. People just always want more. They're driven by desire. It's real fun in the beginning. And for a long time, it works. And this is the problem. It'll work for between 150 and 250 years if you play your cards right. You can do this. And so I think the reason that we end up in these hot wars is the turbulence of a rising superpower, China, a declining superpower, the US. You're already going to get frictions. They're jockeying. And to your point, war is great for business. The thing that I really want people to pay attention to is when the government prints money, they get to take your money without asking Congress for permission.
That's right.
So they can have as much money as they want. It steals your buying power. It is literally the same as taxing you extra money, but they don't have to ask. And so they just go, oh, cool. I can rev up my economy by going and fighting in the Ukraine. I can rev up my economy by going into Israel, Palestine. Awesome. I need to do that because we're in this debt spiral where I want my $7 trillion budget next year. But to get that, I know I'm going to be running a hotter deficit. And so the only way I'm going to be able to pay that debt off, especially as it gets refinanced at a higher rate, is I'm going to have to print money. Again, make it up out of thin air, which exacerbates the problem, but it also kicks the can down the road just enough. I can get elected. I can have my career. I can buy time as the empire basically slowly declines. And when people aren't able to track like all of the things that makes this system work, and forget who said it, but you don't need a conspiracy when all the incentives align.
Can we create a circumstance in this country where people recognize that we need to reduce spending and that people are going to lose benefits? They're going to lose things that they've otherwise had for some period of time. And that is a nearly impossible thing to make happen in a democracy where individuals get to vote. And that's where we see these sorts of things start to unravel. So that's why I'm so worried. And that's why I am a single issue voter. I want someone to show leadership. I think we need a degree of simplicity and leadership around that being the key point and the key objective of the next administration. And unfortunately, I don't think we see either candidates standing up and saying we're going to do that.
Yeah, so if we get either Trump or Biden, both of them increase the debt massively. Why can't we stop spending?
The thing about humans is I think we are fundamentally driven by this concept that I think is best phrased as desire. It doesn't go away. Humans never stop wanting. The natural condition of a human is to see something that we don't have and then create a objective of I want to have that thing I don't have. When I then have that thing, I no longer feel like I'm unmotivated. I now look for, and I naturally see the next thing. I think this is what made humans evolutionarily successful. We were able to then scout out the next meal, scout out the bigger building, scout out the better cave, and it allowed us as a species to continuously progress, expand our population, and succeed and thrive on this planet. But the unfortunate reality is that tuning, that biological tuning, has this effect where no one is ever actually fully satisfied with the things they have. Satisfaction comes from the change in the things that you have, the delta. And the delta from year to year is what drives happiness. And in a voting system, in a political system, it drives how people vote. And because things are inflating, the government feels like there is a need to help make things easier for people. So they put more money and launch more programs to try and reduce inflation. And in doing so, they increase inflation. And then as inflation goes up, the interest rates on the debt have to go up. When the interest rates on the debt go up, it becomes harder to pay down the debt. And so our $33 trillion of debt, a good 50% of it is getting refinanced now, where the interest rate moves from an average of about 3% to 5%. And when that happens, 2% increase in interest on $15 trillion, that's another $300 billion of interest payments a year. And this year, we're already paying $1 trillion just in interest on the debt that the federal government owes to its bondholders, to the people that own treasuries. So we're getting to a point that it becomes really difficult to actually stop the spending, pay the interest, and or reduce the debt levels. And that's how these spirals kind of have played out historically. And every time it's played out, whether it was the Dutch or the English or, whomever you want to kind of look to, there was always this, it can't happen here. This is the leading global economy. This is the reserve currency of the world. It's not going to happen here. And every time the natural forces of arithmetic played out. And that's why I'm so worried. I think that the U.S. needs to, the U.S. voting population needs to be really thoughtful about voting for one's individual self-interest and voting versus voting for the safety of the Union, of the United States over the long run. And people can be taken care of without the wasteful nonsense that's gone on, the tentacles that have grown out of politicians standing on platforms saying, I'm going to make everything in the vending machine free. And what happens from that after 50 years, 100 years. Buenos Aires was like the Paris of the West. And it was the most, I think it was the highest GDP per capita of anywhere in the world.
Whoa.
It was like this metropolis, this burgeoning industrial system. And social policies crept into Argentina like they did throughout Latin America in the 20th century. And there was multiple coups, eradication of the free market system that allowed Buenos Aires to become what it had become, what Argentina had become in the late 19th, early 20th century. And then I think like this guy came along and said, you know, people were sick of it. They've been through the pain. The US doesn't know pain. Like, we have no idea. We could go through another 30 years of this sort of inflation to come close to what Argentinians have been dealing with over the last 30, 50 years. So I think that like there's a breaking point where people are like, we need something different. These systems don't work. And he could be showing people the future. And I think that the fact that he doesn't give a shit, he acts like he has nothing to lose. There's a separate area of medicine, which is cell therapies, where we're taking cells and then editing the DNA of those cells to get them to go and do something in the body. And then we stick them back in the body and they go and kill cancer cells, or they go and repair something. And so that there's about 8 or 9 of those products on the market today.
Wow.
People that get these cancers get this therapy, cancer's gone. It's unbelievable. So we reprogram a T cell, we stick it back in the body, and it goes and destroys the cancer. By the way, that's 15 years old technology. The stuff that's going on now is like light years ahead of that, and it has to go through clinical trials and regulatory approvals and testing and all that stuff. But the stuff that's coming to market over the next couple of years, there's over 1,000 cell and gene therapy products in testing and trials right now to come to market.
Are you aware of any that really show promise?
Lots. I mean, things that can cure blindness. Again, lots of cancer therapies, lots of autoimmune therapies. Everything you can think about in terms of human disease can be addressed by some cell or gene therapy product that's in trials right now, very likely. One of the buyers of treasuries is the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, which is overseen by Congress, but is separate, doesn't actually report up to the president. So the Federal Reserve has this ability to buy treasuries and issue money, issue cash that they don't have, right? So the Federal Reserve has this ability to print the US dollar. And so historically, they've been buyers of treasuries, supporting the market for the federal government to be able to issue debt to pay their bills. And then as more money comes into the system from the Federal Reserve, which is effectively created out of nothing, that money flows its way into the economy. And if you have, for example, 30 trillion US dollars floating around versus 10 trillion US dollars floating around, things are going to inflate because there's more dollars to spend on stuff and the cost of things will naturally go up. That's a super, super duper simplified way of kind of explaining the system. So the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, issues money almost on a loan basis to banks and buys treasuries with the expectation that at some point the US government's going to pay them back. So that's the economic relationship between the central bank and the federal government. And the way that money then finds its way into the system, the federal government can't just print the money, the central bank can, and then those treasuries get held by our central bank, and that money finds its way into the system. So at some point, whether you can look at the total amount of debt of the federal government and think like any household, how much debt can you afford each month? And at what point are you going to go broke? That's one way to look at it. And another way to look at it is that in order to overcome that, there's going to be a lot of money printing because the Federal Reserve can just buy all those bonds and issue that money. And then that money just finds its way into the system. So there's a question at which point there's too many dollars that get printed.
This is the part that people don't understand.
Yeah.
So there's a magic thing that happens when the money is made up. You said, I think, essentially made up out of thin air. I'll say it's made up out of thin air, like completely fake, untethered to anything. It is literally just entry into a database that they decide to click clack, and now that money technically exists.
On the latest episode of Lex Fridman, Ivanka Trump, the business mogul and former senior advisor, spills all kinds of tea. They chat about everything from architecture and design philosophies to life lessons she got from her mom and dad. Ivanka opens up about fashion, hotel design, and even her time on The Apprentice. She touches on personal struggles like self-doubt and intuition, and drop stories about Michael Jackson and surfing. They dive into politics, her work-life balance, and parenting. Plus, there's talk about the 2024 presidential campaign, and she shares thoughts on icons like Dolly Parton, Adele, and Freddie Mercury. For the full context of this episode, click the link in the description below.
What about your dad? Growing up, what did you learn about life from your father?
I think my father's sense of humor is sometimes underappreciated. So he had an amazing and has an amazing sense of humor. He loved music. I think my mom loved music as well. But, my father always used to say that in another life, he would have been a Broadway musical producer, which is hilarious to think about. But he loves music.
That is funny to think about.
Right? He does. Now he DJs at Mar-a-Lago.
Nice.
So people get a sense of, he loves Andrew Lloyd Webber and all of it, Pavarotti, Elton John. I mean, these were the same songs on repeat my whole childhood. I think one of the things in looking back that I think I inherited from my father as well is this sort of interest or understanding of the importance of asking questions, and specifically questions of the right people. And I saw this a lot on job sites. We're talking about how expensive this cooling system would be and heating system would be. And he starts stopping and he's asking duct workers as we walk what they think of the system that the mechanical engineers designed. First few, fine, not great answers. The third guy goes, "Sir, if you want me to be honest with you, it's obscenely overdesigned." But I would see him do that on a lot of different issues. He would ask people on the work level what their thoughts were, ideas, concepts, designs. And there was almost like a Socratic first principles type of way he questioned people, trying to get down to sort of trying to reduce complex things to something really fundamental and simple. So I try to do that myself to the best I can. And I think it's something I very much learned from him.
Yeah, I've seen great engineers, great leaders do just that. You see, Elon do that a lot, which is basically ask questions to push simplification. So
Yeah.
can we do this simpler? And like, why? The basic question is like, why are we doing it this way? Can this be done simpler?
Yeah.
And not taking as an answer that this is how we've always done it. Sort of not allowing yourself, like, it doesn't matter that's how we always done it. What is the right way to do it? And usually the simpler it is, the more correct the way.
Yeah.
Has to do with costs, has to do with simplicity of production, manufacture, but usually simple is best.
And it's oftentimes not the architects and the engineers. It's, in Elon's case, probably the line worker who sees things more clearly. So I think making sure it's not just that you're asking good questions, you're asking the right people those same good questions.
That's why a lot of the Elon companies are really flat in terms of organizational design, where anybody on the factory floor can talk directly to Elon. There's not this managerial class, this hierarchy where you have to travel up and down the hierarchy, which large companies often construct this hierarchy of managers where no one manager, if you ask them the question of like, what have you done this week? The answer is like, it's really hard to come up with. Usually it's going to be a bunch of paperwork. How did life change when your father decided to run for president?
Wow, everything changed. Almost overnight. We learned that he was planning to announce his candidacy 2 weeks before he actually did. Nothing about our lives had been constructed with politics in mind. Most often when people are exposed to politics at that level, that sort of national level, there's first like city council run and then maybe a state level run and maybe Congress, senator, ultimately the presidency. So it was unheard of for him never to have run a campaign and then run for president and win. So it was an extraordinary experience. There was so much intensity and so much scrutiny and so much noise. So that took, for sure, like a moment to acclimate to. I'm not sure I ever fully acclimated, but it definitely was a super unusual experience. But I think then the process that unfolded over the next couple of years was also like the most extraordinary growth experience of my life. Suddenly I was going into communities that I probably never would have been to. And I was talking with people who in 30 seconds would reveal to me their deepest insecurity, their gravest fear, their wildest ambitions, all of it, with the hope that in telling me that story, it would get back to a potential future president of the United States and have impacts for their family, for their community. So the level of candor and vulnerability people have with you is unlike anything I've ever experienced. You learn so much about what motivates people, what drives people, what their concerns are, and you grow so much as a result of it.
So when you're in the White House, people, unlike in any other position, people have a sense that all the troubles they're going through, maybe you can help.
Yeah.
And so they put it all out there. It's still not as divided as it appears to be on the surface, what the media shows, what the social media shows. But what did you experience in terms of the division?
I think a couple reactions to what you just said. I think the first is when you connect with people like that, you are so inspired by their courage, in the face of adversity and their resilience. And it's like a truly remarkable experience for me. The campaign lifted me out of a bubble I didn't even know I was in. I grew up on the Upper East Side of New York, and I felt like I was well-traveled and well-educated. And I believed at the time that I'd been exposed to divergent viewpoints. And I realized during the campaign how limited my exposure had been relative to what it was becoming. So there was a lot of growth in that as well. But I do think, you think about the vitriol in politics and whether it's worse than it's been in the past or not. I think that's up for debate. I think, there have been duels and there's been screaming, and there's, politics has always been a blood sport, and it's always been incredibly vicious. I think in the toxic swirl of social media, it's more amplified, and there's more sort of democratization around participating in it, perhaps. And it seems like the voices are louder, but it feels like it's always been that. But I don't believe most people are like that. And you meet people along the way, and they're not leading with what their politics are. They're telling you about their hopes for themselves and their communities. And it makes you feel that we are a whole lot less divided than the media and others would have us believe.
I look at the surface division, the surface bickering, and that might be like just a feature of democracy. It's not a bug of democracy. It's a feature. We're in a constant conflict, and it's the way we try to figure out the right way forward. So in the moment, it feels like people are just tearing each other apart, but really we're trying to find the way where, like, in the long arc of history, it will look like progress. But in the short term, it just sounds like people making stories up about each other and calling each other names and all this kind of stuff. But there's a purpose to it. I mean, that's what freedom looks like, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, and it's better than the alternative. It really is a leap into the abyss. What was it like trying to get stuff done in Washington? In this place where politics is a game, it feels that way, maybe from an outsider perspective. And you go in there given some of those stories, trying to help people. What's it like to get anything done?
It's an incredible cognitive lift.
That's a nice way to put it, yeah.
To get things done. There are a lot of people who would prefer to cling to the problem and their talking points about how they're going to solve it, rather than sort of roll up their sleeves and do the work it takes to build coalitions of support and find people who are willing to compromise and move the ball. And so it's extremely difficult. And, Jared and I talk about all the time, it probably should be, because these are highly consequential policies that impact people's lives at scale. It shouldn't be so easy to do them, and they are doable, but it's challenging. One of the first experiences I had where it really was just a full grind effort was with tax cuts and the work I did to get the child tax credit doubled as part of it. And it just meant meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting with lawmaker, convincing them of why this is good policy, going into their districts, campaigning in their districts, helping them convince their constituents of why it's important, of why childcare support is important, of why paid family leave is important, of different policies that impact working American families. So it's hard, but it's it's really rewarding. And then to get it done, I mean, just the child tax credit alone, 40 million American families got an average of $2,200 each year as a result of the doubling of the child tax credits. That's one component of tax cuts. During the campaign, it was what they hoped to see happen. Once you were in there, it was what they were seeing, what they were experiencing, the result of the policies. And that was the fuel. On the hardest days, like that was the fuel.
You helped get people together. What's that take? Trying to get people to compromise, trying to get people to see the common humanity.
Well, I think first and foremost, you have to be willing to talk with them, taking the arguments as to why this is good, smart, well-designed policy to people. And, it was one of my big surprises that on certain policy issues that I thought would have been well socialized, the policies that existed were never shared across the aisle. So people just lived with them, maybe in hopes that one day they would have the votes to get exactly what they want. But I was surprised by how little discussion there was. So I think part of it is be willing to have those tough discussions with people who may not share your viewpoint and be an active listener when they point out flaws and they have suggestions for changes, not believing that you have a monopoly on good ideas. And I think there has to be a lot of humility in architecting these things. And a policy should benefit from that type of well-rounded input. It's the only time in my life where you actually feel like there's always a conflict, right, between work and life and making sure, I, as a woman, I'd often get asked about, how do you balance work and family? And I never liked that question because balance, it's like elusive, right? You're one fever away from like no balance, right. Like your child's sick one day, what do you do? There goes balance. Or, you have a huge project with a deadline, there goes balance. Like, I think a better way to frame it is, am I living in accordance with my priorities? Maybe not every day, but every week, every month, and reflecting on, have you architected a life that aligns with your priorities so that more often than not, you're where you need to be in that moment? And service at that level was the one time where you feel incredibly conflicted about having any priorities other than serving. It's finite. In every business I've built, you're building for duration, and then you go into the White House and it is sand through an hourglass, whether it's 4 years or 8 years, it's a finite period of time you have. And most people don't last 4 years. I think the average in the White House is 18 months. It's exhausting. It's the only time when you're at home with your own children that you think about all the people you've met and you feel guilty about any time that's spent not advancing those interests to the best of your capacity. And that's a hard thing. That's a really hard feeling as a parent.